Welcome to this week's podcast,
presented by
The Hilarious Historians.
On this week's episode, we will be talking about the Civil Rights Movement.
This episode will be on the more serious side because this was a very depressing time.
But there's still a lot of room to have some fun. Let's first discuss one of the first steps in the Civil Rights Movement.
In 1954, civil rights attorney Thurgood Marshall pursued the case called Brown v. Board of Education. This case was a combination of 4 cases, all related to the public schooling in different states. In all the cases, African American students were being denied access to certain public schools due to the precedent set by Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson was an 1896 U.S. Supreme Court case that established the separate but equal doctrine of the South. Within the Brown v. Board of Education, Thurgood made the argument that this doctrine was against the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. After a long trial, the decision was reached that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. Because of this, segregation in public education was eliminated.
Man, that sounds really important.
That's because it was.
Anyway, on that note, I think it's time for a game.
Tell me what it is.
All right, it's time to play Guess That Dead Guy! Your first question. Who was a main civil rights leader and believer in the philosophy of nonviolence, and also attended the March on Washington in 1963, giving his famous I Have a Dream speech?
That one's easy. Martin Luther King Jr.
That is correct!
Did you know Martin Luther King headed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957?
No way!
Yeah, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was a group responsible for promoting African American rights, most notably in the Montgomery bus boycotts. Martin Luther King Jr.'s actions were also a contributing factor to ending segregation in the United States.
You learn something new every day.
Yes, you do.
Now time for your second question. Who was the woman responsible for igniting the Montgomery bus boycotts, which were a protest against the racial segregation of public transportation systems throughout the South during the years 1955 and 1956?
That one's a little harder, but I'm gonna have to go with Rosa Parks.
That is correct! Now it is time for your final question. Who was the famous civil rights activist and leader of the Black Panthers, a group dedicated to the ending of white oppression on the black population by any means necessary? He also promoted violent actions and was often criticized by Martin Luther King.
Was it Kanye West?
I'm afraid that answer is incorrect. Kanye West is not dead. The correct answer was actually Malcolm X.
Oh, that makes more sense. Wait, wasn't he killed in the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan when he was 40 years old?
Yeah, I believe he was.
I love general knowledge.
Anyway, with that concluding our game show, it's time to move on to some more serious matters.
I agree. Sydney, can you tell us what the word of the day is?
The word of the day is nonviolence.
And what is nonviolence?
Nonviolence is the practice of being harmless to both yourself and others under every condition. People that believe in nonviolence believe that harm is unnecessary to achieve any outcome.
How fitting.
I agree.
Weren't there many groups that believed in nonviolence during the Civil Rights Movement?
Indeed, there were. 2 of these groups were the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was one of the most important groups in the Civil Rights Movement. They were lead participators in the March on Washington and focused greatly on promoting voting rights in the South. The Congress of Racial Equality was another African American civil rights organization. This group was particularly known for their sit-ins in all-white diners and their freedom rides. The freedom rides were when African Americans rode interstate buses into the segregated South and challenged the unconstitutional segregation of public buses.
Oh, those sound really important.
Indeed they were.
Finally, let's discuss some of the important legal acts that contributed to the end of segregation.
I think that's a great idea.
I agree. The first is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This prohibited discrimination in public places. Second was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial voting discrimination. Lastly was the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which made housing fair, so there were equal housing opportunities.
That honestly all sounds amazing.
Yeah, yay integration.
Well, that concludes today's episode.
Join us next week on
The History of the Kardashians in Pop Culture. Ta-ta!
Ciao, ciao!